My people, Kasala don't bust again. Oh, this Togi they sweet me well. Russia now don't come and talk say if them burn Ecowas well, make them enter Niger, send them go collect, say them they ready for them gidigba. If them burn now well, make them enter Niger. Now this now Ecowas don't they in confusion. Oh, some of the countries say we don't they support them before, don't they withdraw one after the other. I beg, no be only me go hear this. Share this video. Share them. See them here.
The original government to discuss the form an intervention could take and what consequences might there be. We're joined by Dan Smith, the director of the Stockholm Peace Research Institute. Dan Smith, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you, my pleasure.
Now, what's the situation like there on the ground in Niger?
Well, there are a lot of different pressures pushing in different directions. So there seems to be considerable public support for the coup. There's been demonstrations in favor. Internationally, there's pushback, but Russia has also stepped in to support and to warn against intervention. And meanwhile, it seems like ECOWAS may be having second thoughts about the intervention.
Second thoughts. Now, they're always rather loath to make a decision to come into Western African countries, but it seemed like this was different.
It did seem like this was different, and then there was some pushback within Nigeria in particular. And Nigeria, of course, is the big regional power in West Africa. President Tinubu seemed to be very strongly in favor of an intervention. But a meeting that was scheduled to be held in Accra in Ghana, which would be an essentially technical discussion between the military chiefs of staff about what the options are for establishing the standby force, what the options are for the form the actual intervention would take. That meeting has at the moment been suspended. That's said for technical reasons, but indefinitely. So there's clearly an amount of back and forth and discussion still going on about this. And that may be partly linked to Russia stepping in and trying to warn ECOWAS off.
Really? You think it's the Russians there in the background warning them off?
Well, that is a new development within the last half day, that Russia has spoken out against intervention. And of course, there's a lot of rumor circulating about Wagner. The Wagner mercenary group, I think, we've discussed it before in this program, I think. But then in the context of the uprising in Russia. Prigozhin is still active. Wagner is still highly active in West Africa. Has many forces in Mali, also Central African Republic, which is not too far away to the east. Prigozhin himself was present at the African summit, the Russia-African summit in St. Petersburg quite recently. So you can see there's lots of signs of concern and possibility there. So I'm not saying that the ECOWAS potential rethink was definitely a product of the Russian intervention, but I think one can feel Russia and Wagner in the background of these events, as indeed one, of course, can feel also the USA and France and the EU in the background. Everybody's circling around trying to figure out what the best thing to do for their advantage.
Well, exactly. Now, the interesting thing is that the country which is maybe keenest among the ECOWAS countries to put troops where its mouth is the Ivory Coast. What do you think's behind that?
Well, I think in part it is that if you go through the record of ECOWAS military intervention since about 1990, when it was tried in Liberia and then in years after that in Sierra Leone, Côte d'Ivoire stands out as somewhere where a well-organized, you could say, compact military intervention was made by ECOWAS that helped restore order, restore legitimacy to government, and bring in stability. And perhaps, therefore, Côte d'Ivoire has a particularly positive view about the consequences of intervention. But of course, military intervention, sometimes it works in the way that was intended. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it leads to a mess.
Well, exactly. And in terms of what would happen this time if troops from other African countries came into the country, you mentioned that you can see a growing sway of people who are in favour of the coup. How would they be met by these, they might call themselves peacekeepers, people who are coming in to, sort of protect order, etc. But they might be very much opposed by the people there on the ground.
Yes, I think it's always hard to tell when you see the demonstrations like this, and you hear the comments, the kind of the vox pop comment of France go home, we don't want Macron, yay to Russia. You can sense, okay, from the individual, that could be a real, heartfelt, authentic opinion, right? But is that reflective of the country as a whole? And the answer is that we don't know. To the best of my knowledge, there hasn't been some reliable opinion polling done asking the citizens of Niger, now would foreign intervention be a good thing or a bad thing? In general, populations dislike foreign military intervention. Very often, even if they supported it at the beginning, they dislike the details of it because military intervention is a really quite heavy thing to sit on a country. You've got big vehicles, you've got lots of men in uniform carrying guns with the helmets on, kind of following orders that are given by somebody and so on. Peacekeeping forces obviously tend to behave more gently. So I don't think an ECOWAS intervention would go in kind of shooting and gunning for trouble. That also means that a demonstration against them of ordinary people in the streets, then that's something that they have to slow down for. It can bog them down a bit. That increases the motivation for the political supporters of the coup to mobilize that kind of demonstrative opposition. I don't think that in the first instance, if there were an intervention, that there would be a shooting war, but I think it might just be adding to the political complexity of the situation. The West has a big stake here because President Bazoum was seen as being not only a Western ally, but also a democratic leader and a legitimately democratic leader, properly elected in a politically stable country. And this overthrow, therefore, is kind of quite severe blow to regional stability and also to Western interests.
And speaking of Western interests and experts, we've got a soundbite which we'll play of Linda Thomas Greenfield, the US ambassador to the UN. Listen to this for a second.
Look, we still recognize President Bazoum as the democratically elected president of Niger, and the conditions he is being held in right now are unacceptable. And we have called for his release along with the Secretary General as well as members of Ecowas.
Now, Dan, can you imagine the situation where there would be blue helmets actually appearing, the UN forces?
I think that is less likely because I think that the UN Security Council would find it, it just wouldn't agree. I mean, at the moment, we've got the USA and Russia on opposite sides of the discussion about what's the legitimacy of the coup, what the action that should be taken is. So it would surprise me if they were able to find unanimity in order to provide the mandate for a UN force to go in. The second thing is that in general, those powers and those governments that participate in UN Blue Helmet operations over the years have increasingly wanted those peace operations in Africa to be carried out by African forces. So therefore, under the aegis of the African Union, very often with its peace facility that has been heavily funded from outside, or indeed by ECOWAS. So I think that the preference amongst the Western members of the Security Council would, regardless of Russian opposition to such a decision for a UN force to go in, I think the preference of the Western members would be, ECOWAS should be doing it and we should be in a supportive role. We should not be on the front line. the peacekeeping forces should be regional peacekeeping forces. I'm sure that's the way they're thinking about it.
Now, you mentioned the possibility of ECOWAS going in and getting bogged down. Now, could that happen literally just as much as in a figurative sense? We saw, of course, in Ukraine that the Russian forces ended up in bogs, ended up with, trying to go off roads, etc. What are the conditions like in Niger in that regard?
To be honest, I'm not too sure about that. But certainly you need to look up when the rainy season is. But my recollection of the rainy season is that we're not there now in the little bits of West Africa, which I do know. But from personal experience, I can tell you that if you do go there in the rainy season, I mean, roads get temporarily washed away would be too strong a word, but they do get eroded so that just going kind of 10 kilometers up the road becomes a major enterprise. And yeah, it can be very, very difficult. And the thing to add to it, just to go back to something I said earlier, is that military vehicles are very big and very heavy. And even where you've got well-paved, well-made roads that are not being attacked by the weather conditions, you still get them churning up those roads incredibly quickly. Anybody who's been to somewhere like Kosovo or Bosnia-Herzegovina, let alone to any of the African states where there have been these peace operations, has seen how that is. And so it could be, as you say, that you get an actual physical, climate-based, weather-based slowing down of the operation, as well as anything to do with local demonstrators.
Well, Dan Smith, thanks very much for joining us and for giving us that excellent overview of what's going on there in Niger.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. And that's all we've got time for the moment, but stay with us on TVP World. This morning we've got much more coming up.